All right.
Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're about to do a deep dive into the 2020 presidential election with journalists Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes, who are here to talk about their revealing new book, Lucky: How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. This is the third book that John and Amie have done together. John, who's worked for Politico and Bloomberg News, is now a senior political analyst with NBC News Digital. Amie, who also used to write for Politico, is a senior correspondent with the Hill newspaper, where she covers the White House and national politics. Together, they first wrote HRC about Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State and how she recovered politically from her loss in the 2008 Democratic presidential primaries. They followed this with another book a few years later, Shattered, about Clinton's failed 2016 presidential campaign. Now, and what for the publishing business is near record time, comes Lucky, which chronicles last year's election. The book takes readers behind the scenes of the Biden and Trump campaigns, as well as the campaigns of several of Biden's Democratic rivals. Rest assured, John and Amie offer no evidence that Biden stole the election, but they do note at the outset of the book that Biden's victory was quite close, closer than many surveys and political pros had predicted. And while Biden deserves a lot of credit for the way he presented himself during the race as a candidate of character, compassion, and competence, all of which resonated with voters, John and Amie make a compelling case that Biden also benefited from some very lucky breaks at key moments. To help provide for an especially lively and informed discussion this evening, Steve Kornacki, national political correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, has graciously agreed to be in conversation with John and Amie. One magazine not too long ago labeled Steve an election icon, and anyone who's watched him, especially at election time, can't help but be wowed and awed by his mastery of electronic maps as he posts votes coming in and makes sense in real time of all the numbers amid the seeming chaos. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, although you're not visible to us, you'll still be able to ask questions if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Lucky. So John, Amie, and Steve, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Brad. And I'm sorry if anybody's had my my screen up here, but the perils of Zoom, my monitor just fell a second ago, but I believe I've rebalanced it and I think we're good to go. But Brad, thank you for the kind introduction, and Amie and John, great to be with you. Congratulations, to both of you. It feels like it was just yesterday. I was telling Amie before the event, I was sitting in for one of the MS hours 4 years ago in early 2017 when Shattered came out. I remember having Amie on to talk about that. I remember telling her then how much I enjoyed Shattered, and it made me so excited for this book, just knowing it was coming out and knowing I get a chance to read it, because I love campaign books in general, and then to get the chance to read it a little bit early and participate in this event made it an extra special treat for me. So thank you for both of you for making me part of this event, and let's get going. I think I'll some of these maybe I'll ask one of you, but in general, just both please feel free to chime in on anything I ask here, and just kind of make this a freewheeling conversation. And in that sense, I'll start with the first question, which has to do with the title. And Brad was just alluding to this. I think everybody looks back at this election, and you note it in the book when you look at the final margin there, not the electoral college margin itself, but within the states that decided the electoral college, it really would not have taken a big switch in terms of just the raw number of votes cast in a few states. It really wouldn't have taken a big switch for Biden to lose and for Trump to win. And we can all think back to the Democratic primaries, and you write about it in the book, where Biden is just buried in the early states and then turns it all around in South Carolina. I think everybody's got moments where I think they might look back and say, hey, Biden kind of got lucky there. But the title lucky, what does it mean to you? And where did Joe Biden get lucky in this election?
John, do you want to kick this
I'll,
off?
I'll start with that because I was more of an advocate for that title. I think we decided we're going to be honest and tell everybody behind the scenes sort of the discussion that we had. So I'll start with why, sort of why lucky. And Steve, you obviously alluded to two of the big keys there. One is you're talking about 43,000 votes over 3 states. If Trump wins 43,000 more votes over Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, he's the president of the United States for a second term. People who follow elections closely, we're talking about a quarter of a point in one of the states, a third in another, and 2/3 in the third state. Those are coin flips for campaign operatives. Nobody who saw a poll or data analytics that came in that told them that they were, up a point going into election day would feel comfortable that they were going to win. And so you look at that closeness that people sort of forget about because Trump was on one side saying that there was fraud, which was obviously not true. On the other side, Biden was trying to claim a mandate and say, look at this huge electoral college victory I won. Of course, the Democrats didn't believe it when Trump said that in 2016. His margin, or the other way to look at it, Hillary Clinton could have beaten Trump with about 77,000 more votes in those 3 blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that Trump margins Trump's victory margin was larger than his defeat margin. So that's part of it, just sort of, the million things that go into this. I mean, how many millions of dollars were spent in this election, and it comes down to this very close margin. Also, those moments in the primary where Biden essentially is driving the car, gets past the train that's coming at him, gets home, gets out of the car, walks around the back, and sees that it's sort of scraped the edge of his car. These very, very close scrapes with defeat down to the point where he, we write about this in the book, where his aides came to him and said, you might have to refinance your house in order to continue to meet payroll for the campaign. But I also think, and I'll stop here in a second, there are other things that are lucky. The Democratic Party is lucky that Joe Biden won the nomination because it is not clear to us, and I would argue that more than it's not clear to us, that any of the other candidates would have been able to beat Trump. And so the Democratic Party can look back and say they won and know that there was a chance that they might have nominated somebody who would have lost. And then the third thing, of course, with what we saw in the aftermath of this election, our republic stood. And I think for that, we're all lucky. And it didn't have to go that way. The Capitol got stormed. The president looked at every possible opportunity he could to deny the people their right of self-governance, and our system held. And so, like I said, there are people that won't feel this way, but I think for most Americans, they feel lucky that the republic remains intact.
So I should add that when John and I were writing the book, over the course of the last year, we constantly were kind of thinking about titles and what this title was. And we kept saying, lucky, got lucky, got lucky. And then I had a change of heart, if I'm being honest. And John knows, I sent him a very panicked text one night. I think it was in that week after the election, where the election was so close, we didn't know where it was going. Trump was already saying fraud, claiming fraud. And I had a moment of, I don't know, I was hesitating on the title. And I said, do you really think that this is appropriate to call this book lucky? And, we had our own personal conversations with people. I talked to my editors about it at Hill. We had a conversation with our editor, Kevin. I talked to my mom and my sister, anyone who I could confide in, do you think this sounds right? And finally, I was convinced over time that it was the right title. When I took a step back, not to say that I didn't have my moments, on the 6th of January, I was also concerned about it, but it felt right. It felt like Biden had just, by the skin of his teeth, won this election. And when you go back and you look at all the anecdotes we have in our book, and you look at the primary and how he was barely able to scrape by, and then how he went into the general and was able to win even with the pandemic and COVID and the president getting COVID, and all the other components about Elizabeth Warren taking out Michael Bloomberg at the right moment. I mean, there were so many lucky breaks for him, and it felt right in the end. And I'm really happy and pleased with the title. And I'm grateful for John and for our editor, Kevin, who kept trying to sort of talk me through it and make me feel comfortable. And I'm thankful for their patience, so I could finally come around and accept it. Just to give you a window into the view of what we were dealing with.
Can I add one short thing there? The other piece of it, and the reason that I felt convinced about, one of the reasons I felt convinced about it, is it came from the reporting.
Yeah.
You know, this was not our story of what happened with Joe Biden. It was the story of people who were close to him, aides and allies, people who were outside of his, outside of his sphere, but within the Democratic Party that were parts of other campaigns, a little bit from the Republican side. And so I felt like this is something that really comes from the reporting. And also Joe Biden talks about being lucky all the time. The last, I don't want to spoiler, I don't want to go too much away, but one of the quotes in the book that we have from Biden is something his father said that he talks about a lot. And he says, it's the lucky person who gets out of bed, puts their feet on the floor in the morning, knows what they're going to do, and thinks it still matters. You hear Joe Biden frequently refer to luck, and I think he's somebody who believes that there are, I don't think he thinks that he was that much better of a candidate or, a human being in 2016 than he thought in 2020 than he thought in 1988 or, in 2008. So like what made it happen for him this time? A whole lot of hard work from him and a whole lot of other people, and maybe a little bit of magic dust.
I'm curious too, speaking of titles, we've mentioned your last book, Shattered, about the 2016 campaign. And that's the backdrop for 2020, the unexpected election of Donald Trump in the first place. Back in 2016, the unexpected loss of Hillary Clinton and the political world that created. As you were reporting this book out, talking to folks around the Biden and the Trump campaigns, other Democratic campaigns during the primary, how did you see the lessons or the perceived lessons of the 2016 election shaping what the Biden campaign was doing, shaping what the Trump campaign was doing, shaping how they thought about this election? Did it provide a compass for them? Did it mislead them in some ways? What effect did that have on this campaign?
Well, I think for starters, Steve, what we saw in this campaign was that Joe Biden had a message. And I don't think Hillary Clinton had one. And that was one of her biggest problems in 2016. She kept, went from I'm with her to something else to something else. And in the end, people didn't know what she was for. They knew what Donald Trump was for. They didn't know what she stood for. And I'm talking about your average person. I would talk to people and they'd be like, I don't know. And this time, Joe Biden was actually very consistent in his message. He opened up with the same message. I can beat Donald Trump. I'm the only one who can beat Donald Trump. That was sort of his primary message to, I can break the fever. I can help unite the nation again. And people kind of knew what they were voting for this time around, even if they were really voting against Donald Trump. They knew where they were and what they had to do. And I think that was the biggest difference in terms of the two campaigns. But it's funny because John and I interviewed a lot of people over the course of this campaign, and they all kind of referred back to Shattered. And we were very honored and complimented by that because they all kind of used it almost as a guidebook going forward on what the lessons were. And this is sort of what this book is. This book is really important too, because it's not only a postmortem, but it tells Democrats what they need to know going forward. And that is key here. We're not just talking about a campaign and how someone was able to win it. We're talking about how Democrats can win this going forward in 2022 and 2024. And this book also provides that kind of roadmap.
And to that extent, I think that in particular, the Democrats have focused a lot on the extra 7 or 8 million vote pad that Trump has had. But you don't win chess matches with a whole bunch of field goals. You got to play by the rules and use the tools available. And they have not figured out a way to ensure that their popular majorities actually bring them the presidency. We've seen the Democrats win the popular vote a couple times in the last 20 years and lose the presidential election. And I think part of that is that they're not focused enough on the places that they need to win and the ways they need to win in those places. And you see the same thing with like the focus Republicans have on state legislative races. We'll see that now with this round of redistricting where Republicans are in a good position to write maps that put them in the House majority. I think a lot of times, and this is not true only of the Democratic Party, but a lot of times there are disagreements within parties about approaches, and some of the people who are making loud arguments are not always making the arguments that are the most aimed toward making the party win. And one last thing about what was in Shattered that got followed up on, we wrote extensively about Jen O'Malley Dillon, who ended up being Biden's campaign manager in the general election this time. In Shattered, we wrote about her. She was the runner-up to be Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. And I think it would be very hard for anybody to have read Shattered without coming away with the impression that we thought that she was the right person to have been the campaign manager in 2016. So, Biden ended up doing that. I'm not saying he did it because of us. I'm sure there are other people around him who made the same judgment that she was probably the most capable operative around. But that was another piece of the roadmap that we saw kind of show up this time.
One of the big themes that I think I took away from your book, from the reporting you had in it, was that Biden was underestimated, misjudged, misunderstood by both his enemies and his friends, and so many different angles to ask on this question. I want to go through a couple of them with you. The one I want to start with, because it's the one that jumped out the most to me, and I think might surprise some people, has to do with former President Obama. And you've got the public partnership, 8 years, president and vice president, Joe Biden talking about his friend Barack. But it was really striking to me from some of the reporting you had in here about Obama's assessment of Joe Biden as a political product, I guess you could say, and really what that said about their relationship. I'm curious if you could talk about that.
Well, they have a very, I think they're very fond of one another. I should start there. They definitely like each other a lot. They came around a lot during the administration. I think there was a little bit in the beginning of some tension, and then they came around. But I think the now president was always a little bit miffed about Obama keeping him out of the race in 2016. He always thought that he was a better candidate than Hillary was. So we'll start there. But it's very interesting because they have a complicated relationship, and they've always sort of done this delicate dance. One of the most fascinating things that I think we unearth in this book is that Joe Biden has always said that he told Barack Obama not to endorse him. He said it time and again throughout the campaign. We found out in reporting this book that conversation never happened. And so we still don't know, I think the Obama people were kind of scratching their heads and wondering how that came to be. But that was interesting. And then we have other moments where in the book, Obama calls a bunch of Biden aides into his office, and he's wondering how they're set up and how they're going to be running their operation and what they're going to do. And I think as it was explained to us, it was that the former president was sort of worried about his former partner embarrassing himself and kind of tarnishing the Obama legacy as well. So that's interesting. And then we have another kind of my favorite anecdote. I think I was telling you about this earlier, Steve, is there is a scene in the book where Obama is meeting with a bunch of Black donors. He's very fond of them also. He sees them as friends. He can feel a little loose in the conversation. And so he's talking to them about, they're asking him, what do you think about the horse race and who's up and who's down? And he is sort of going to bat for Elizabeth Warren more than anyone else. And at the end of, he's talking about her and he kind of bashes Mayor Pete a little bit at the same time. And then one of the donors at the end has to say, wait a minute, you forgot Biden. And that was a very revealing moment about where the former president's head was in the fall of 2019 as this campaign was really picking up steam.
Was it, John, maybe you could pick that up. I mean, that's in that moment really jumped out at me too. And from Biden's perspective, what did it mean? What has it meant to succeed in the face of something like that from Barack Obama?
I mean, it's really amazing that, the traits that we talk about in the book that are so endemic to Biden that really helped him through this election are this tremendous belief in himself and a determination. Persistence, I guess, is another way to put it. This is a candidate whose aides went to him and basically said, "Get out of the race." I mean, the writing was on the wall in New Hampshire, and he even had to tell Jill Biden, just hang on till South Carolina. When you're telling your wife, just hang on, she's obviously not in a place where she's like convinced that you're doing well. And so, but I think that, from Biden's perspective, he's always been doubted. He's always been underestimated. And I think he is somebody who, even when he's not honest, comes off as earnest. And I think that's real about him. And I think he's the nice guy piece is real. You don't see him ridiculing other people. Obama did ridicule as a political tool. Trump does ridicule almost, every second of every day. And so I think it hurt Biden. Not only do I think that, sources said it hurt Biden that all these people thought he wasn't good enough to win, that they thought he shouldn't run in 2016. And, we go through the sort of painstaking courtship that Biden does of Democratic luminaries as he's getting into the presidential race, and people just turning him down and turning him down. I'm not going to endorse you. I'm going to keep my powder dry. Our colleague, the Reverend Al Sharpton, is in a very, I think textured scene at the beginning of the book. Biden meets with him behind closed doors. It's just the two of them, and Biden's like, sort of asking for an endorsement, and Sharpton's like, Obama's not going to endorse this guy. Like, why would I? And then he says to Biden, listen, if you run, I'll surely check in with Obama, which is basically like, call my secretary and maybe I'll get back to you. And sort of the same thing with Stacey Abrams. Biden, brings her to his house, and they sit down for lunch, and Abrams knows what's up, and she's like, let me just start with this. I'm not endorsing it. And so, you go through all these like sort of painful machinations. I think Joe Biden probably feels pretty vindicated. Barack Obama didn't believe he could win. 24 other Democrats didn't think he could win. Donald Trump didn't think he could win. And here he is, the president of the United States. We haven't spoken to him about this, but I imagine that somewhere deep in his heart, he feels pretty vindicated by it.
And there, as we say, you talk about with the title, there are so many individual moments you can point to in the campaign as wow, if X didn't happen, maybe it's all different. But the most dramatic one, I think, to me, reading it was, and we've talked a little bit about it here, Iowa has happened. Iowa's a complete mess, but Joe Biden gets buried in it. New Hampshire, Joe Biden gets buried. Nevada, very, very distant second. They come to Nevada, and I think it is Cedric Richmond, you report, who has endorsed Biden, supporting him. Even he has doubts about Biden's performance on the campaign trail. Clyburn's going to endorse him, but he's not sure. What turned it around for Joe Biden in that moment? Because he's as close to the collapse of his campaign, I think, at that moment, than he was the entire way.
I think it was definitely part Clyburn. I think mostly Clyburn. And we get into this in the book. We kind of reveal how that endorsement came to be. It wasn't a sure thing. And I think what was really interesting was he had concessions. He went to, I think Biden's aides all expected him to endorse. Clyburn was thinking, I need to kind of talk to him about this and what this moment means and what I want out of this. And what he wanted was a Black woman on the Supreme Court. And he told him just that. He said, you need to do this. And he said a perfect place to talk about it would be at this debate. He went to the debate in South Carolina. He's sitting, watching the debate unfold, talking about Clyburn. And he's seeing that Joe Biden is not talking about this one big concession. And so we have a funny sort of anecdote in the book where his colleagues think that he's racing out of the auditorium, and they think he needs to go to the bathroom. And in reality, what he was doing was going to find Joe Biden backstage, and he sees Mayor Pete and he dodges Mayor Pete backstage, and he goes and finds Joe Biden to say, why haven't you done this yet? We talked about it. And so that is sort of when you see the upstairs, downstairs of that moment, and then you see Joe Biden come out and actually talk about it. That's sort of how it all happened, how it all unfolded. And I do think that Clyburn, John said this earlier, but I think Clyburn played such a key role in doing this that he made Joe Biden probably would have won South Carolina, but not by that much. And he made it a significant election and enough to see the dominoes fall shortly thereafter.
And that nuance is so important because, you know, this conversation that Clyburn has with Biden, as we write about in the book, Clyburn's already cut an endorsement ad for Biden, but he hasn't made the endorsement yet. He hasn't sent out the ad yet. He certainly hasn't gone to a microphone and talked about how Clyburn's late wife loved Joe Biden, how he was their favorite. And so what you see is Clyburn gets what he wants from Biden, and then Clyburn gives this, you know, very heartfelt endorsement. And you wonder what happens if Clyburn just walks out to a TV camera without Joe Biden and says, "Yeah, I'm endorsing Joe Biden." You know, what's the difference there, right? And so that, you know, the need on Biden's part, and his aides told him not to make that promise about the Supreme Court. The need on Biden's part to make sure that Jim Clyburn is in a really good place, you know, becomes important. And these, you know, it's these little things. And you know, Steve, you've been watching, you know, presidential elections probably since you were, you know, 2 years old, with a big board in the crib or whatever. But I mean, you know how this stuff works. And South Carolina in particular, the African American community in South Carolina is both bellwether and influencer for the Black community around the rest of the country. And we write about this a little bit in the book. We did also a little bit in Shattered. Because of the way Democrats apportion their delegates, the African American community has an outsized impact, you know, particularly if one candidate is really running up the score with African American voters. And basically in South Carolina, Biden not only becomes the favorite of African American voters in terms of like a little bit more than other candidates, it really gets to the point where, you know, he's clearly the candidate of the African American electorate. And that doesn't have to happen that way, right? It could be more split. Once that happens, he's starting to, you know, reel off delegates by Super Tuesday, and sort of what they call thresholding other candidates in majority African American districts, meaning he gets all the delegates and they get none. So really a huge moment. And you know, I've never seen anything like it in politics in terms of just how fast that race changed with all those candidates dropping out. Barack Obama finally getting in on Biden's side, and you know, the invisible hand of Barack Obama playing a role in that. We write about that a little bit in the book. But really, I mean, you know, we live for this stuff because I think of it like sports. There's only a couple of outcomes in the end that you could have, but there's a million ways to get there. And sometimes those ways are just so unbelievable, incredible. It's exciting. And I think that's what we saw, you know, for Biden between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, where he basically in 3 days wrapped up the Democratic nomination.
I think it was almost exactly a year ago this week that all of that was happening. And you're right. I remember that from that Saturday night in South Carolina, just a couple days later. And it felt like the the world had changed. And of course, the world was also changing in other ways at that point with COVID setting in. Let me ask you a couple questions here, and we'll get to I see them lining up here, a bunch of audience questions. A couple big picture questions about the general election matchup. Then Biden gets the nomination. It all changes, starting with South Carolina and then Super Tuesday. But that theme of Biden being misunderstood or misjudged, can you talk about that in terms of Donald Trump, the Trump campaign? What did Trump see in Biden as Biden emerged from the Democratic primaries? What did his campaign team see? What were they expecting, and what did they get?
We have a scene in the book where we're in the Oval Office, I believe, right, John, with Kellyanne Conway, and they're watching Biden actually talk. And Kellyanne Conway says to Trump, if we lose to this guy, we're pathetic. And that sort of was how they saw, they thought that Trump could win and win big. Their internals were telling them that they were winning bigger than what the polls were saying. They didn't really believe the hype around, all he has is his face. And so that is sort of where they saw things. I can't remember, John, who did he say he would rather run against? There's a really good
I think it's actually him asking Kellyanne,
yeah,
who would you rather run against? And she said she'd rather run against Warren, but she'd rather debate Biden.
Right.
Because she felt like Warren was like a tough debater.
Right. And she pointed, I think, to the evisceration with Bloomberg and how she totally, completely got rid of him. And, I think they saw Biden as very vulnerable. They thought, obviously around COVID, that he was hiding Biden, as they coined him, and that they could really be out in front of it. But it's funny because when you look at the Trump campaign, and we have a lot of reporting in this book about the Trump campaign, when it came to COVID, Brad Parscale, his then campaign manager, went to him and said, "This could be your undoing." And President Trump didn't really believe him at the time and said, "No, I mean, this has nothing to do with politics." And it's funny to read that now in this moment after he's lost. But it kind of gives you a window into how they definitely saw Biden then.
And what were, we talk about COVID itself, again, about this time last year, that changes everything. President Trump during the campaign ends up contracting the COVID virus. You write about that first debate where the Chris Wallace moderated presidential debate, Trump and Biden, and Trump is interrupting constantly. What was the confidence level, would you say, of the Trump campaign as things unfolded? Because obviously we're all watching this in the summer and fall, and the polls are consistently showing Biden ahead nationally, ahead in the swing states. We're remembering, hey, Hillary Clinton was ahead nationally, in a lot of the swing states in 2016. What was that looking like? How was this election looking behind the scenes to the Trump people?
It's really amazing, Steve, the parallels with 2016 for sort of both sides, watching this with a sort of deja vu feeling of this feels like a little bit like last time. That was going on both sides. Now, on the Republican side, there's sort of a spectrum of belief. I mean, Trump is, 100% in with, I'm going to get a whole lot more people to vote, and I'm going to win this time. And, he can't be disabused of the idea that he's just running away with it, right? At least he's not telling anybody anything different. But if you go and talk to the campaign operatives, they knew that he'd taken a huge hit from COVID, not from getting it, but from the administration's response to it, from standing on a stage and telling people to inject disinfectant. That this was something that was not benefiting him. And here's Biden in his house choosing when and how to message about it, in contrast to Trump, who's out in front of everybody all day long, every day, and sort of being critiqued in real time, and not really understanding that a national crisis like that for a savvy politician is a political opportunity to benefit, not a political opportunity to to lose ground. But we talked to any number of people in both campaigns, and there's not one of them that thinks that that COVID was helpful to Donald Trump or not helpful to Joe Biden from a political perspective. Now, most people don't want to put their names to that, but that was it. I mean, I don't know anyone who thinks differently. Like, if the people watching want to make a cogent argument about how Trump actually benefited from COVID, I'd be interested in hearing it. As far as the parallel of 2016, on election night, there was a period, maybe 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern, roughly, where a lot of people in the Trump camp were like, this is just like we had last time. We're going to pull off the victory that nobody said we could get, including Donald Trump, who's very much, he's receiving in the White House, as we report, he's like receiving calls about like, congratulations, you won a second term. And his data crunchers are like looking at it and they're like, we have, the bottom didn't drop out on us, and we're also not like certain we're going to win. We're not hitting the marks that we'd really love to be hitting. And so they're like, this is really close. And in the Biden camp, the same thing's going on, right? Like Jen O'Malley Dillon is thinking to herself, oh my God, what if we lose? She was not expecting that to be, the polling for, public polling had this huge lead for the Democrats. The internal polling for Biden, because they had adjusted their metrics, and we write about this in the book, adjusted their models, was more bearish than that. And what actually happened was less favorable to Biden. So they're watching it come in and they're like, there's a moment of like kind of shock where they're like just waiting to see what the next set of vote totals are. And that kind of carries through the night until Fox calls Arizona for Biden. And both campaigns have the same reaction, which is they can't call Arizona. It's too close right now. The Trump people, Trump's going apoplectic. He's like, call the Murdochs to everybody around him. We have a lot of reporting on that. And then, but at the same time, in the Biden campaign headquarters, his data analyst chief is looking at it going like, I can't believe they just called this. Like, thank you.
I can tell you, for whatever it's worth, standing at that map on the air and finding out that Fox had called Arizona, I was also a little surprised and couldn't quite understand it. But of course, Arizona did end up, I think it was about 10,000 vote margin. It did end up.
Sometimes better to be lucky than good if you're prognosticating when you shouldn't be.
Yeah, I was, there's a line that came to me. Somebody, I think it was an old baseball manager, said, don't confuse favorable outcomes with good decisions. And I've thought of that sometimes. But I see here we've been asking folks, and feel free, keep sending them, questions. Basically, this is going to be our virtual mic in the audience here. So let me see if I'm doing this right and call up the first question here. So here we go. This one is from Barbara Sirota. She says, why did Biden not do even better in industrial states when Trump did not measurably improve people's jobs or lives?
So that's a great sort of existential political question of like what Biden failed to do that he wanted to do. And I mean, what I would go back to is that wherever Biden thought he was, wherever Democrats thought they were with the electorate, the Biden folks knew that they had to like take a few points off of whatever his numbers were with non-college educated whites. And so that when they readjusted their modeling, that's what they did. That's basically like, we're not going to do as well as the other polls say that we're going to do with that set. What's the failure there? I don't have a good answer to that, because to be honest, the difference in what the Democratic message is from Biden versus any number of other Democrats that have run statewide in industrial states recently, like it's not that different. They have different ways of kind of phrasing it, but like they're all kind of saying the same thing. Like the future is in renewable energy. And we see now as Biden is president, tougher line on China, tougher line against Trump. I mean, he was a free trader for his entire career. Now he's not. I think that helped him, but I don't think it helped him as much as he thought it would.
Let's try this one from Nikki Erickson, who asks, which is true, that Biden wanted to run in 2016 or that he didn't? Joe has said he didn't want to run in 16 because of his son's health, but it's also clear that Obama promised 16 to Hillary.
I think he did want to run. I think he was boxed out in a way by Hillary. We report on that a bit in Shattered. He felt kind of annoyed by that. By the time he had actually wanted to run, she had already tied up donors. She was off to the races, and a lot of Democrats felt like it was her year. And he was kind of resentful of that. I think his senior advisor pulled him aside in that moment and said, hey, it's probably not a good time for you to run. I think he even writes about this in his own book, but I think he really wanted to run. I think behind the scenes, he thought Hillary was a terrible candidate. We talk about that a little bit in the book. He was actually he didn't think that she did very well in speaking for the Democratic Party and luring Democratic voters from these key states. And so I think he always sort of had this in the back of his mind. He wanted to run. He knew as early as 2018 that he wanted to pick a woman running mate, and we report that in the book as well. So you could see that this was sort of marinating all along from 2016.
I think we have a question here that follows up a little on the Obama-Biden discussion we were having. Adam asks, what did Obama make of Biden's strong numbers among African-American voters during the primary? I was bullish about Biden winning the nomination from the moment he announced, in part because he alone had strong support among Black voters. Why didn't Obama see this? His enthusiasm for Warren and Beto at different points makes even less sense in hindsight.
In the book, we use Obama as kind of a Greek chorus for the Democratic Party. He seems to go through like the flavor of the month, just like everybody else. He kind of likes Beto, and then he's like, oh yeah, Warren's okay. And he's going to try to bring the party together, and he keeps good touch with Bernie. One of his close friends said to us, he flirted a lot. And I think that's probably the right way to look at sort of how Obama and I think a lot of the Democratic Party treated this race, right? Like they're all sort of like, speed dating the candidates. I think that I can't speak to what Obama thought about African-American affinity for Joe Biden. What I can speak to is some of the reasons that African-American voters were drawn to Biden. One of them, and this is something Biden talked about a lot, and I think it was helpful to him, was he was part of the Obama-Biden administration, right? So he worked for Barack Obama, and there are certainly people who say like that was a good reason for return loyalty. I think another one of the reasons is that a lot of people in the Black community saw Biden as the most likely to win. And even if he didn't match up necessarily with their particular flavor of democratic values or ideology, the idea that he might be able to beat Trump and the idea that it might take somebody who was a moderate white male candidate to beat Trump, I think stuck with a lot of Black voters who said like, we went with Hillary last time and that didn't work. Maybe it's time to put up somebody who, looks like Donald Trump and campaigns a little bit differently.
There are a couple of questions here, a little bit about the process for you of reporting and writing this book. Here's one from Constance who asks, how did you write this book on top of your regular reporting jobs? How did you know what to cover when you were flooded with details?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I'm thankful to my editors. I know my editor Ian's online watching this right now. They were very good about giving me a lot of time to do reporting and writing on this book. But, we spent the last year plus reporting this book. We kind of had a head start, obviously, with Shattered. And it kind of all came together. It's tough. I mean, we essentially had no lives people say that, use that term loosely, but we really had no lives. It's like writing a book is like living in a pandemic because you don't really go anywhere or do anything or see anyone. And so it was like doubly that for us, where all we're doing is talking to each other and interviewing people and spending our entire weekends reporting and writing. And, we missed the Christmas holiday season, New Year's, all of that. We blew right through it just to get this book out. And so a lot of it is just we have very good bosses and families who allow us to do it, but it's not easy. Writing a book never is, but in addition to all of this going on around us.
And let me just say, Amie, in addition to all of the other things that she's doing, actually primarily, and everything else is in addition, is a mom and a single mom. And so, her ability to get that stuff done is twice as impressive as mine.
It's very kind of you. Thank you.
And I had it teed up here. The screen is moving around. My apologies if I forget who asked the question. I remember, here it is. Robert asks this again. Sorry if this is a little unfair, but I'm curious too. I thought it was a good question. What would the title have been if Trump had won?
Battered.
You think we're kidding, but we actually knocked that idea around.
Usually there's a list that's like kind of a working list of like, if this candidate wins or if that candidate wins. And so, the last book, Shattered, was the only one that appeared on both the Hillary wins list and the Hillary loses list. Shattered referring to the glass ceiling had she won. And so, that was sort of a foregone conclusion. In this case, I think the leading contender if Trump had won was Battered. And I'm not sure if I wanted a rhyming book pair, but it seemed appropriate.
We broke a little news there. I like this. And then one more on the process here. This is from Megan, who says, with a vastly different primary field from 2016 to 2020, can you speak to the differences of reporting for Lucky compared to Shattered? Basically, it went from 2 candidates to, I guess we count Martin O'Malley, 3, to about 24 in 2020.
Yeah, we left, was it Wayne Messam alone? It's a lot harder. There's no question about it. And, you still have like essentially the same time constraints, although we got this book out on a faster schedule than the last one by about 6 weeks. It's brutal. And you don't know which ones are going to end up mattering. You don't know what the storyline's going to be like. Oh, Kamala Harris drops out in November. Oh, wait, now she's vice president of the United States. And all that Kamala Harris stuff that you were reporting on while things were going on, is now valid and valuable. And maybe somebody else who you thought would be part of the story ends up not being part of the story as much because they fall off. So we were very convinced that Marianne Williamson was going to be the nominee. I'm just kidding. But, we basically in this book, I think it's half a dozen of the Democratic candidates plus Trump. So it's Biden, Harris, Sanders, Warren, Buttigieg, and a little bit of Klobuchar. And you may see an appearance from another candidate, but it's basically that half dozen plus Trump and in this book. And there was only so much that we felt like we could really handle. Richard Ben Kramer, I think, did 6 candidates in What It Takes. And, I think that was on a slightly slower timeline than ours was. And he did such a great job with it. It's just, you're sacrificing. The more number of people that you have to try to cover, you're sacrificing detail.
It's funny you mentioned the Richard Ben Kramer. I remember reading that book, What It Takes, way back 25 years ago. And one of the candidates he chose to focus on for 88 was Joe Biden, who, of course, imploded, 6 months. Yeah. And I remember reading it 25 years ago thinking, what a waste. Hundreds of pages of Biden. And here, he was ahead of his time on that one. Here's a question, no name on this one, but sort of looking at some of the big picture takeaway that you have here from your reporting. How can Democrats get luckier, in quotes, in rural areas? So, Democrats, you see still that Trump strength, Democratic weakness in rural areas. As you reported this out and took a look at the country, what did you see there in terms of what lessons Democrats can draw?
I think the biggest thing for them in rural areas is sort of what the Stacey Abrams approach is to urban areas, which is I think they have to talk to voters there more consistently and not just show up at election time. I mean, look, politics, all of politics, most of the country doesn't vote. I shouldn't say most of the country doesn't vote because this last election, most of the country that was eligible voted, but a lot of the country doesn't vote. A lot of the eligible adults don't vote. Both sides at this point are basically trying to amp up the number of people who agree with them that show up to the polls rather than trying to do any sort of persuasion. But I think if the Democrats were to try to, have a bigger lock on things, they just have to communicate more and not make it about just the election. And they have to, I mean, by the way, I mean, I think they support a lot of policies that are helpful to a variety of rural voters. So there are things that they can point to in what they're doing that are helpful, and they can point to things the Republicans are doing that aren't. I mean, the trade war with China was devastating for a lot of Trump's constituents. A lot of it's sort of cultural affinity stuff, but I think one of the things that Democrats would benefit from is if they spend a little bit more time, courting voters who live in areas that the Democrats don't live in.
And speaking of Georgia, you mentioned there, Jennifer asks, was Georgia a fluke in 2020, or do you see it as a real swing state going forward?
I think it's a real swing state because of what Stacey Abrams has done and what John just mentioned, that she really built the infrastructure there. And it's something that other states should model. We talk a lot about that looking ahead. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons. As John mentioned, you need to really invest in the state and not just show up around election time.
And one of the things that I think, kind of got missed in this election, but I think the insiders within the Democratic Party, the sort of smart set, understands this. In Georgia, what you saw with the election this time, one of the things we noticed after 2016, Stacey Abrams in a 2018 gubernatorial race got like 100,000 more raw votes than Hillary Clinton had in a presidential race in Georgia, right? So, obviously had figured out some pretty good formula for stoking turnout. And then this time around, you see this huge explosion of votes in the presidential election around Atlanta, and you see that carry through in the Senate races. You did not see that same kind of thing happen in the presidential in other big cities that were important to Democrats. In Detroit, there were fewer votes for Joe Biden than there were for Hillary Clinton. In Milwaukee, you saw at the very least a much smaller increase in the Democratic turnout than you saw across the country, right? I actually think Milwaukee ended up being about the same number of votes as 2016 for the Democrats. Philadelphia, same thing, a very small increase in the percentage of, very small increase in the number of voters in Philadelphia itself. Biden wins in the suburbs outside Philadelphia in those three counties that are closest to Delaware, Chester, Montgomery, and I am blanking on the other county at the moment. But the point being that not the same thing is happening with voters of the same color or the same income or the same education everywhere in the country at the same time. And what Stacey Abrams has done in Atlanta looks very sustainable compared to what the Democrats are trying to do in some of the other big cities.
Here's one from RJ, who has read the book and has a question about the Biden campaign. He says, in the book, you talk about the divide between what you call the poobahs. These are sort of the older campaign veterans, relationships with Biden, knew him going in, predated 2020. The divide between the poobahs and the new staff that was brought onto the Biden campaign. How did that divide impact the campaign?
It was tricky because there was no real flow chart there. I think you're kind of seeing that in the White House too, a little bit. But you had sort of all these older advisors, and then you had Greg Schultz, who was the primary campaign manager. He didn't really know how to manage up during the primary. And there was sort of this silent coup that was building around kind of demoting him. He had no idea what was going on until it actually happened. And then you had Jen O'Malley Dillon come in, and she kind of knew how to manage the so-called poobahs and worked with them. And you had Anita Dunn also, who's sort of not really an old school Biden poobah, but also knew how to deal with them. There were so many people and no one knew exactly who reported to who and who did what. And so there was a little bit of some murkiness there. I don't know if you want to add to that, John.
I was just going to say there was a huge effort to try to have a little bit of a younger set and a more diverse set as part of the campaign, because Biden was surrounded by older white and mostly male advisors. And so the idea was to hire a bunch of people. And the tension point is that, like, the older set, the poobahs and Biden himself, didn't really listen to the advice that they were getting. And in some cases that was helpful to Biden, right? Like in the general election, you see him advised by some of his senior folks who are senior younger folks that he needs to embrace defund the police, and that he needs to apologize for the crime bill in the midst of the post George Floyd killing, social unrest and protests for racial justice. You see this group within his campaign like really pushing him to do that and sort of adopt the activist area or activist view, and he just won't do it. And I think that was very helpful to him. We saw so many campaigns where defund the police was sort of wrapped around the necks of Democratic candidates as an anchor to bring them down, and Biden wouldn't do it. And I think that helped him. We actually have a scene in the book. I'm not sure this has ever been reported before. Jim Clyburn goes to talk to John Lewis on the House floor about defund the police while all this conversation is going on in the Biden camp. And Clyburn says to Lewis, what do you think about defund the police? And Lewis says, it reminds him of the 60s, and he says, "Burn, baby, burn, killed us," meaning Stokely Carmichael and the more sort of activist and less nonviolent set within the civil rights movement that sort of evolved out of the into the mid to late 60s, that crushed the nonviolent movement that really, like, the lunch counter sit-in type of movement that Clyburn and Lewis had been a part of. And he says, "Burn, baby, burn, killed us. Defund the police is going to kill Black Lives Matter." And so John Lewis thought that defund the police was a dumb thing politically to be saying. This is the sort of long and short of that point.
I think we can squeeze one more in here. There's a question from ZK looking at Trump. Says, a question: did Trump implode during the Chris Wallace debate? Was Trump triggered somehow? It was bonkers. Well, talk if you would a little bit. I mean, this was obviously a huge moment in the campaign. Talk a little bit about Trump's performance there in the second debate. Was it planned? Was that reaction performance spontaneous? And what was the fallout in his campaign from that?
He was getting sort of mixed messages. I think he, in prep, was hearing one thing, and some people felt like you should just let Biden kind of trip over himself. If you let him talk and let him speak, he's going to be a gaffe machine. And I think that was sort of one strategy. And another strategy was sort of like get at him, interrupt him, attack him all the time. And I think he chose to do the latter, obviously. But that debate was so ugly. I don't know if it ultimately moved the needle in any direction.
It certainly didn't help Trump. And I think that if he had had two debates like his second debate, he would have been certainly better off on election day. I mean, I don't know anybody that watched that debate that thought that Donald Trump was like, walking out as a world beater. I think they saw him walking out as a bully and a little bit out of control. And, the other piece, Amie was talking about how one set said to let Biden talk. The other set said, basically was saying to him, this is what he went with: if you pressure Biden, who had a stutter when he was a child, he will not be able to respond to you, and he will look bad and feeble on stage. And so Trump went for the knockout punch, and it failed miserably. Ended up knocking himself out.
All right. Well, I see we have reached the 9:00 hour here. I do see there was one last question. I won't put you on the spot from Melanie, who was asking what the next book is. I won't try to make you commit to 2024 right now, but I will say that if you do decide 4 years from now to do a third installment here, I will be one of the first in line to buy it, because this book it's just it's just compulsively readable. Anybody who followed this campaign, and that's got to be everybody on this call, you will just eat this stuff up. It's just terrific. And John and Amie, really enjoyed hearing from you for the last hour. Really enjoyed the book. Congratulations on it, and good luck with the launch.
And Steve,
Thank you, and Steve, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We are in awe of you, and we're so glad and happy for you on your amazing run this past year.
Everybody should pick up The Red and the Blue by Steve Kornacki.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing
Two
this.
can play at this game.
All right, guys, great moderating, Steve. It really is a pleasure watching a pro interview other pros. And John and Amie, as you know, by being the first to publish, you become the standard against which subsequent books about the election will be measured. And you've definitely set the bar high. There's a lot of great stuff in Lucky, and we only just skimmed the surface this evening. So I join Steve in encouraging everyone watching to read John and Amie's book. A reminder that in the chat, you can find a link to purchase Lucky. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.